Okay, and I'm going to post in the chat a link to my slides and start sharing my screen. And now I have to change your window so I can see all your lovely faces too. Oh, come on, it gives me a way to make it bigger than that, doesn't it? There we go. Okay. I have two screens. I want to take advantage of them. All right, so everyone can see my screen. Intro to GitHub, no terminal required slides. Yay, okay. And if you want to follow along on your own computer, you can click the link that I put in the chat. And you can refer to that later. It'll be there for, you know, the internet. It lasts forever. So even if it's only on archive.org. So anyway, you know about me because Margaret already gave me my introduction. So I'm going to go right into this. One quick note that this content I originally developed as a workshop for an organization called Girl Development. All of the curriculum that we make there is licensed Creative Commons with an attribution license, which means that I need to attribute where I made it before. So that's what I'm doing here, and it's adapted to a shorter format and a documentarian audience. So talking about what we will talk about in this workshop. First, the difference between Git and GitHub, because very often people mix those two things together as one. A little tiny bit about your GitHub profile and account settings, understanding what repositories are and how to work with them, how to work with files in the GitHub web UI. You can do quite a bit with it, you'd be surprised. And making your first pull request if you haven't done one before, and finding and choosing projects and communities to contribute to later on. So starting out, Git and GitHub. What is the difference between them? So first, starting out, Git is a version control system software. It's an open source software that you can run on your own computer. You can run it on a server. There are other services besides GitHub that host Git as a server. It's the software itself that manages versions of files that you store. And it doesn't have much beyond that control of the versioning of the software. Now, what GitHub does is it layers on top of that a social collaborative element. And their slogan before, I'm not sure if it still is, was social coding. And the whole idea was sort of to take code as something that people can collaborate in an open atmosphere and kind of like a social network for code. And as a matter of fact, when you talk about your GitHub profile, it is kind of like a social media profile for open source. For some, this can be kind of like a LinkedIn profile or another form of that. It has information about repositories that you may have made, and we'll talk about what those are, organizations you're a part of. This little green tile thing is an indicator of contributions that you have made to repositories, which could be public and private. And it's based on days. So like, I think it goes top to bottom. I'm not sure if it's top to bottom or bottom to top. That these are the days of the week, and then the weeks all the way across the year, the last 365 days. You can see, for example, the patterns in my coding don't do a whole lot of contributions in the weekend because those the ones at the top and the bottom are empty. It also measures the types of contributions. So contributions to open source aren't just contributions to code or to the content inside of a repository. It can also count as filing bugs and issues, reviewing other people's work, and things like that. And those are all counted, and it now has this interesting analysis that shows you how much you're doing of each one. And another thing that it has in here that I'm actually not sure where it is because I didn't want to turn it on for myself is there's a checkbox you can check that says you're available for work. And that also shows up on your profile and is searchable. So all sorts of things that can kind of tell about you in the open source world. You can also leave it pretty empty. You can leave private contributions out of there. There are a lot of things you can leave out of this profile. To access the settings of that, when you are logged into GitHub, you can click on your profile avatar up in the upper right corner and then choose settings. They have recently changed their UI, so it looks a little bit different from this. But some of the things to sort of highlight in there that you can change things in your profile, the available for hire option that I mentioned, notifications, two-factor authentication I recommend. There's also a facility for blocking other users. This is an open social environment and not everybody is well behaved. So you do have the option to block people if they are problematic. So just highlighting that that's out there. So talking about the people, moving on to repositories. A repository is, and very often people just call it repo for short, is what Git calls a project folder. And it's basically a folder that contains all of the project's files as well as information about the version history of all of the files that are inside of that folder. Essentially, you're just talking about a folder, but we call them repos. And on GitHub, what it does is it takes those repositories and adds an extra layer of information and collaboration tools on top of it. So each repository has its own page on GitHub. And as an example, if you're following the slides, you can click this picture and it'll take you to this particular site, which is the San Francisco Write the Docs repository for the website, San Francisco Write the Docs. And it has in it, the first part is the organization or user who owns the repository, and then the name of the repository itself. And aside from the code part, all of these other things are things that GitHub adds on to Git. None of these things are actually part of Git itself. They're all add-ons that are part of the GitHub service, things that let people interact with each other on code, automated actions you can perform on the code that you have hosted with them, documentation, analyses that they perform that you can look at to find out more about repositories or communities, and then tools for watching to get notifications, adding stars to things to favorite them and look at them later, or just sort of vote on them to say they're cool. There are definitely open source projects track how many stars they have as an indicator of success. And so, yeah, you might want to go to this one and star it up some too. Another thing that you'll find inside the repo page is a list of the files. And that would be the first thing that comes down underneath that header. And something that actually was confusing to me the first time that I dealt with GitHub repositories was I would see these files and then next to it, it seems like that should be a description of what the file is for or something like that. It's not. It's actually it's a description of the last change that was made to it, which is called the commit message. And you'll learn more about those as we go. But that's a description of the very last change that was made to this file. This is the last change that was made to something inside of this folder. And then the time that that change happened. Also, there are some files inside of GitHub that are handled specially inside of GitHub based on their name. We'll actually talk about some of these later on in the workshop about how those different ones are used by GitHub in different ways. But some of those files, usually in all caps, if you see those are special to, they have special functionality within GitHub. All right, so now you kind of have a sense of what's out there in the repository. Now we're going to look at working with files inside of them. And in order to do that, we want to first start with a repository that you actually have control over. So we'll do that by making your own. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and demo it and talk through it, and then we'll come back to look through the slides, and you'll have that as a reference later too if you want. So I'm going to go to my user page, and you go to the plus in the upper right and choose new repository. You can follow along if you want or not. And it gives you like an auto-generated one for inspiration if you want. And one time when it did it, it was Fuzzy Engine, which was kind of funny. So I stuck with that for my demos. So, and this is a repo about fuzzy engines, whatever that means. A description of it. For the purposes of what we're doing today, make it public, but you can make them private. GitHub used to restrict that to paid accounts, but now you can actually make unlimited private accounts, even on private repos on free accounts. So that's pretty cool. Also, in order to make this work better, you have to have at least one file in the repository. So we're going to start by adding a README file. GitHub will make these few files for you automatically if you want. And they also have these learn more links that you can learn more about what each one of them is for. Git ignore is really about when you're working locally in addition to in the web UI. And licenses have to do with how that repository is shared. Something that when you choose one of these files is it tells you what branch it will set as the default branch. This is a recent change in GitHub that came about due to the recent re-awareness of the Black Lives Matter movement. And a lot of people started looking at, you know, the word master is what was traditionally used as the default name for branches in Git and GitHub and other Git services. But that's got some problematic history to it. And there are plenty of other words that you could use that still convey that don't have that problematic history. Primary, main seems to be the one that people are sort of settling on. Production's another one. I've heard arguments that, sure, master is like the original of a master recording or something like that, but we don't need that metaphor. I think people understand primary just fine, or main. So they're actually planning to change. I have changed my settings. So yours may say master because that was the default. You can change your settings so you have a different default. And apparently GitHub is also going to change their default in the coming months. So it's an interesting new thing that I learned while I was re-updating these slides. So when you create the repository, now we have something that looks kind of like that other repository. I have my username, the name of my repository, and you'll also see up in the URL bar that it matches up with the things that are in the UI. I find that GitHub's URLs are usually pretty easy to sort of parse what you're looking at, which is helpful. And the file that they created for me, the README file, there aren't any other files, but it does have a list of the first change. They call it an initial commit. And it happened now. Well, not quite now, but close enough for them. And so now you should have your repository ready. So I'm going to go through the steps of what we did. And so now we're going to start by adding a new file to that repository. And I think they either changed this screenshot was taken yesterday. And in my, yeah, see, okay, so depending on which side of the A/B test you're on, you'll either see a plus here or you'll see add file. I've tried it multiple ways and I've seen both. So you either click add file or you click the plus and choose create new file. And then you have a space to name your file. And I'm just going to say, not a very useful name, but we have a new file. And this new file, very exciting. So you have a text editor with a few options and things like that in there. Then if you scroll down to the bottom of that, it has a space for committing the file. So saving and committing are slightly two different steps within Git. Inside of the GitHub UI, you can't really save without committing, so they're all in one. But it is possible when you're working locally to save something and then commit it, like, yes, I want to put this in the history by choosing to commit. But when you're working in the UI, save and commit, basically the same thing. That's a good question about whether it allows spaces in the file names. If it does, it's going to convert them because every file name is a URL path inside of GitHub. And you can't have spaces in a URL path. Generally speaking, it'll vary what you're using when you're naming things. I would say that the most common way of dividing words would be hyphens, because that's the closest thing that we have to a standard for white space in URLs, but it'll depend on what you're working in. Yeah. And then you can add a description. This is the description that shows up in that listing for the file. I'm just going to say, yeah, go ahead and create file new text. They put that in as a default for you, but you can override it and write something else. And then I'm going to choose to commit it directly to my main branch. Whatever your default branch is, what they'll put in there. We're going to talk about the new branch thing later. So when I commit that file, now you can see it added into the folder. And I can do that to the main repository. So we have that one in there. I'm going to go back to my slides. You can see the steps that we went through for that. Now, That worked because I was creating a new file that I was editing. Like I opened that up and it gave me an editor, but there are lots of things that you might put into a repository, most notably images, especially in documentation, that aren't text. They aren't something that you can just type in an editor. It's an actual self-contained file, like an image or a video, which we call binary files because they're not in human readable format. And when you're going to do that, then you're going to do an upload, which starts at the same spot, adding a file, and then you'll choose to upload files. So going back into my file, you can choose add a file and upload files. And you could theoretically upload things that aren't binary files, but usually, I don't know. Usually when I'm uploading, it's because it's a binary file. This is the only way to do a binary file. I'm going to choose pictures of my dogs. Sleepy tongue Petunia. So you can actually upload more than one. You can drag them and drop them in groups, or you can add multiples at different times. I'm going to say add picture of Petunia. And I'm also, again, going to commit that directly to my default branch. All right, so now I have an uploaded file. I have my text file that I put in there by editing, and I have my one that uploaded. And if I click on it, I can see it. It's really big, a sleepy Petunia with their little tongue sticking out. So both of those ones got added. Now, let's go back to here. So we have that, and it goes forward. You can also edit an existing file, at least if it's text-based. You can't edit a binary file because you can't open an editor and just change the bits. So for a text-based file, let's look at, I'm going to open up the README. You can actually find that little pencil icon sometimes directly within the README file. This is a special thing about GitHub. If you have a readme.md folder or file, actually, it could be readme.txt, it can be readme.rst, I think readme.asciidoc works as well. Anything that's called readme inside of a folder, it will automatically display that file after the file list, which can be kind of a useful introduction to a repository or to a folder within a repository. So anyway, this one's showing here, but I can also click on the file itself, which is still there. And there's this little pencil icon in the upper right corner of that editor, or the view of the file, I should say, which takes me to the same editor as before. And you'll note that this looks a little bit different. And actually, I would prefer it to have a space in there, but more consistent markdown. So as you can see in here, this is big and bold, and it's not just plain text. That's because this particular file is written in Markdown. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Markdown. Some of you may not be. It is a shortcut language to marking up text that can be used usually to convert to styled HTML. So by putting this little hash in front of fuzzy engine, that treats it as an H1, a top level heading. And in GitHub, they automatically style Markdown files so that they look nice, which I think is one of the reasons why Markdown is as popular as it is, because people are using it all over GitHub. But it also does the same thing for restructured text and AsciiDoc. So you can do that too. If you are unfamiliar with Markdown, I have a link to GitHub's Markdown guide that tells you about some of the different sorts of ways you can mark up your text to style it, and it'll automatically be styled within files that you save on GitHub. So I can say, for example, this is a link, whoops, and I can put it into these brackets. Sometimes people have, I'm gonna just make it github.com. That's kind of boring, but one of my favorite mnemonics for this, so what this is doing is this is the text of the link, and this is the URL of the link. And I've heard a bunch of people trying to remember which comes first or which one goes in the square brackets. And my favorite one is squirrel. So you start with the square is the squaw, and then you have the URL after. So it's the squirrel. So that's kind of a fun way to remember that one. And if you put an exclamation point in front of it, then you can put in a picture. And this is actually using one of my favorite easy things for putting in placeholder images. If you put in placekitten.com/the width in pixels/the height in pixels, it'll automatically generate an image for you and put it wherever you put it. It's super useful. There are actually lots of others. There's like Place Bear. There's ones that place pictures of Nicolas Cage and Bill Murray and all sorts of weird picture placing things. But I don't know, I fall back to kittens. So you can use that for styling your text as a short little intro to Markdown. So again, I'm going to commit that to the main branch. So you can add, you can upload, and you can edit. There is our, that's not a very good cropped one, but some of them are better than others. That is my auto-generated picture of a kitten and a link that works. So that is a handy thing about GitHub, because if you were just to open this file inside of your computer, you're just going to see a bunch of text. You're not going to see it styled like this. And a lot of repositories will actually use this quite a lot. Many open source projects, all of their documentation is just written straight up in GitHub and taking advantage of this automatic styling. So, switching on to the next thing. Oh, and I forgot to mention that. When you are editing, you can click the Preview Changes tab and it will show what your thing is going to look like before you save it, which can be handy because if, for example, you forget to put the space between the little hash and the title, it doesn't format it as a title, it just says hash title. And in the preview, it'll have these markings next to it, that things that are added will have a green line next to them, things that are being removed will be struck through and have a red line next to them, lines that are edited will have a yellow. So it'll show the changes that you're making, not just the formatting of the new thing that you're setting up. Now, this is one that I didn't know right away, and I think people might not know about it, which is when you want to put files into new folders. So as we're working in this repository, everything's sitting in the main folder, and so far I haven't figured out how to put something into a subfolder. Well, when you want to do that, you can actually go to make a new file, or you can go to edit a file, and when you go to edit or add, you always have this space where you can change the name of the file if you want to. But you can also type in subfolder or whatever. I don't know, I'll call this a different name. That's a boring name, but files. And then when you type slash, it automatically adds that to the path. And you can keep nesting it and move things into other subfolders. So I was finding that pretty useful when I did that. And as you're doing it, you can also delete. So if you have something that's already inside of a subfolder and you want to move it up a level, you can go into there and you just hit delete and it'll delete the thing, which is not intuitive because it's not inside the box, but you can do it. So I'm going to put that into a subfile right now. And if I go back into the repository, you can see that now I have a files folder. That new file is no longer in the base level of the repository. And inside of that, I have my new file.txt. Now you will notice that if you click on a binary file, you don't get that little box for changing the name of it. Similarly, when you upload them, you don't get that little box. So if you want to put full images inside of a file, you're in kind of a tricky spot. Maybe you want to put them into a subfolder that you haven't made yet. Maybe I want to make an images folder. There's nothing in here for creating a new folder. The reason why is because Git tracks files. And the folders that the files are in are just a property of that. That's the path that leads to the file. So you can't track empty folders. You can only track files and the folders that they're inside of. So the only way to make a new folder is to make a file that goes in it. That's the only way that Git will actually know that the folder even exists. So in order to do that, I'm going to make a new file. Say you don't actually want to make a file, you just want to have an empty folder. Well, then you have to make a throwaway file. One convention that people sometimes use is to call that file keep. There's nothing special about calling it .keep. If you have something that hides files that start with ., You won't see it in your folders locally. There's nothing that like makes GitHub treat it differently or anything like that. It's just a convention. You can call it whatever you want, but other humans might be familiar with that convention and go, oh, the reason this empty file is in here is just so that they could make the empty folder. So I'm going to make that keep folder. And I forgot to put it inside of a subfolder, so I didn't make an empty folder. I just put it into the base. But that's easy. We can edit it. And I'm just going to say images, because that's what I want to make this for. Make a new commit. And I keep clicking. These links will take you back to the base of the repository. So now I have this files folder, which has, that's not the one I wanted. I have this images folder that has this not super useful empty keep file in it. But now that I have this folder, I can add a new file in here. I can upload another picture of my dogs into there. And we'll do that one. And now that I've done that, and I have a file in there, if I want to, I can actually delete that keep folder file. And on any of the files that are inside of GitHub, there's a little trash can icon for deleting. Can you move the image from it? No, you can't move images within the GitHub UI. It's very frustrating. So what you actually have to do to move an image or any binary file, anything that's not text editable, you have to actually re-upload it into the new place that you want and delete it from the old place that you don't want it, possibly downloading locally if you need to do that in between. So yeah, it's kind of a pain. And I have a slide about that. So this talks about changing the path, making your empty keep folder, and the lovely process that you have to do if you do want to move an image file inside of your repo. Same is true if you want to change the name of an image file inside of your repo. Yeah. Okay. So I have this try it thing in here. We don't have time within an hour-and-a-half workshop for you to go through these things, but this is something that if you want to, if this is something you want to practice with, you can go back and go through these steps and try this on your own. You could follow along while we were doing it, or you can also go, okay, did I get what I was doing? And try going through that process on your own. So now that you've worked inside of your own repository, we're going to talk about working with someone else's repository, because that's the whole point of open source. If you're just making your own things, well, they're public and you could also have people contribute to yours. But we're going to talk about what you do when you're contributing to other people's repositories, because this repository that I've made, even though it's public and you can even visit it, I'll put it in the chat if you want to see it. And anybody can visit it. But you can't make changes to my repository because it belongs to me. And the same goes for other ones. However, part of what is really useful about Git and the contribution layer that GitHub puts on top of it is that it enables people to contribute code to other repositories where they don't have permission. And the way they do that is with forks and pull requests. So that's the next thing we're talking about. A fork is, well, first I'll say that if you go to a site, a repository that you don't have control over. So this is an example. This is a repo created by my alter ego upside down purple me that's not so thorough. In that one, if I want to make a change to it and I say add file and create a new file, it gives me this message and says, hey, you're making changes. You don't have permission to this. And so we're going to make oh, it's interesting how they did it that way. I'm going to try editing the existing one. I might have changed that too. Yeah. Oh, that's because I already have a fork of it. So if you don't already have a fork of it, it will tell you, we just made a fork for you. Now it's telling me to go get to my fork and update it that way. So it'll make that fork for you, which is what I'm talking about in the slide here. You can also on the repository, just go directly and click the fork button and make a fork of it. Now, what's a fork? Let's go to that fork that I have. And it inconveniently doesn't link me to it. So I'm gonna just type it into my URL.
Hit the number after fork.
Okay. So if you do that, you can see all of the people who have forked the original repository. So, and that also gets me to my fork. You can see that not only did Not So Thorough make that, and I, Vero Thorough, apparently I made another user called Mostly Thorough that also made a fork of this repository. And so yes, when I'm inside of my fork, you can see that this is the one, this belongs to me. It's under my username and it has the same name, but it also says that it was forked from the original that was created by Not So Thorough. And so forks are not just a copy, it's like a copy that knows where it came from. However, anything that you make, any changes that you make inside of your fork don't automatically apply to the original, which we call the upstream typically. And any changes that happen in that original upstream repository don't automatically get applied to your fork. Once you've forked from it, you each have your own path. So I'll go through that. However, you can make changes by proposing changes from your fork and proposing to apply those to the original. And thank you for that tip, Chris.
And one more tip for you is if you hit on the word fork, it'll show you.
Take you right to it. Well, I don't have a fork of that one. If you don't have a fork and you click on the word fork, it'll make a fork. If you do have a fork already, it'll tell you, well, do you want to fork it somewhere else if you have multiple orgs like I do, or it'll give you a link to take you to your fork. So, all right. So getting back to what I was going to do in here. So if you have a new one and you haven't made a fork of it before and you go to create a new file, it took me automatically to my fork. And if I make these changes, so special fork file. Now, when I go down to these choices, if you have done it by clicking the edit inside of the upstream repository, it'll actually have a different UI. It'll look like this. It'll say propose file change, and it won't give you the branch options because the only thing you can do in the other repository is propose a change to it. In mine, what it's doing is telling me to change it to my existing branch that I have in my fork of the original. And when I do that, it gives me the option to, it didn't give me the notification for it. Okay, a lot of the automatic things that it does were not popping in there. So you can click, if the automatic thing doesn't pop up in there, you can click this new thing that shows up here. It's saying, hey, your fork has something different. It's one commit ahead. It has a change that the original repository doesn't have. And so would you like to make a pull request to it? And you can also compare. So I can click and compare. And this is where it will take you automatically if you have the view that says propose file change and you click that. So this comparison view is comparing what has changed on your fork against the state of the original. And so your fork is considered the head, and the original that you're comparing against, that you're proposing to merge your changes to, is the base. And so it shows a list of any commits that I have made to my fork that aren't in the original. And within that, it shows a detailed view of the changes that I made within it. This is called a diff. And the diff will show how many files you changed. If it added a new file, it will also show little indicators of how many lines were added or removed. And then it has green or a plus sign next to the things that are added. And it'll have red and a minus sign next to things that are removed and lines that different. And something that isn't always noticeable, like I didn't realize this for a while, well, and they probably didn't have it for a while too, is that this shows the source code diff version. There's also a rich diff version, which gives the styled preview mode. So when you're looking at your compare changes, you can see that preview too, even after you've committed. So I can see all the changes that I've made. It has what I want. It doesn't have anything extra. And then I can create a pull request. So when you create a pull request, what it's doing is it's making a request to the maintainers of that other repo to say, I want to make these changes. And you give it a title that usually says more than create my special fork file.md that describes what you're doing, and usually a useful comment in there that describes why you're doing it, ways to test it. Very often repositories, especially ones that are well prepared for contributions, will have a pull request template. And that's one of those special files that I mentioned towards the beginning. If they have a file inside of there that says pull request template, then when you go in here, there will actually be pre-filled content in here for you to answer or fill in or add to help guide you in making a proper pull request. This is not a proper pull request. It's not nearly descriptive enough of what I'm doing here. But when you do that, then it again shows you the changes you're making, just in case, and you can create a pull request. There's actually also, relatively new, an option to create a draft pull request, which that still shows up in the other repository, but it says, hey, I'm not ready for this to be reviewed yet. It can't be merged yet. You can also change it later, then flip it over to say that it is ready for review. So maybe there's something you want to put up, but you want to make changes to it still, or you're not sure about it, or you want to test how it runs through their testing suite or something like that. You can create a draft first before you say, okay, now you can take a look at it. But for now, we're just going to create a regular pull request. And that shows up in the list of pull requests. And I'm going to go back to my slides. So I have the changes and how to fill out a pull request. Now, something we haven't talked about yet is branches. Branches are like forks inside of your repository. In the same way that you create a fork that splits off from another repository and you each have your own sort of path of development from that point that has a shared original history but branches off. Branches work the same way, but inside of a repository. So I can make a branch from my main branch, and once that's broken off, I can make changes on that branch, or I can make changes on my main branch, and they won't automatically be applied to each other. And so if we go into to make a branch inside of your repository, so if I go into, I'm actually going to do it inside of, well, no, I'm going to do it in my fork. So I'm inside, that's not my fork. I closed it. Use my handy shortcut. So when you're inside of your repository, it doesn't have to be a fork, actually. You can have branches in any repository, and they often do. But if you look up in the upper left side, you can see which branch you're on right now, which version of the code you're on right now. And you might have several here. If you start typing one, and I'm going to type one called big changes. If you type one that doesn't exist, you can type one to search for ones that do exist. If you type one that doesn't, then it'll give you the option to create one. Now, when I do that, it's telling me something about the other repo that I'm forked from, but it's at the same point as master. So I have create my special fork file here. And if I look at my main branch, it has the same exact commit message. So these two are in line with each other. And so I'm going to go into my big changes one. The useful thing about creating a branch on your own repository is all those things that we've been doing inside of the UI, where you go into the other repo and you say, click, make a new file or edit a file. You're only changing one file at a time, but sometimes you might be making a contribution that requires changing multiple files at a time. Maybe you have a doc that you're adding and there are images that go into it. So when you want to do that, the way you do it is create a branch inside of your repository, or if it's a repository you have access to, you can create a branch within it. And then make changes within that branch just like you would your regular master or something like that. So you create that branch, and then you can make changes to it as you want to. So this particular one I made from something that was already updated, but we'll go with it. So I have this, let's say that I want to add a new file. This one file. And now I'm going to commit this to the branch that I'm in right now. If it doesn't say the branch that you want, then you have to go back out and select your branch and then go to make your file again. So I'm going to commit it to my big changes branch. And it's going to prompt me now that I've made a difference. It's going to say, hey, do you want to make a pull request? I don't want to do the pull request yet because I want to make more changes. So then I'm going to take that, and I'm actually going to change that one file and put it inside of a subfolder. And maybe I need an image that goes with that too, inside of that subfile folder. So I'm going to upload an image, another dog picture. And again, it's committing to the same branch. So by making multiple commits to the same branch, I'm bundling them up together. That's one of the nice things about branching, and one of the things that makes Git and GitHub useful is that you can branch off and make a bunch of changes inside of a separate space that doesn't affect the rest of things before you propose merging those to the rest of things. So now, if I've made my couple of changes, I made a subfolder, and inside of it, I have some text and I have a picture. And now, okay, I'm ready to make my pull request. So I can compare my files. And so now it's comparing against the master main branch on the upstream repository against my big changes branch. And I can see that it's got 4 commits that I made, and it has that other my special fork file. It also has the picture that I uploaded and the other new file. So it's got all 3 of those changes all in one. I could actually change this to the master branch, and you can see that the changes that it proposes is different because there was only one change back on that branch. I made all my other changes inside of the big changes branch, but that's the one I want to compare. So you can add all of those ones together into one. And it'll automatically name it after your branch by default, which sometimes works. I have no other comments. And now I'm going to create my pull request. And yes, thanks, Margaret, for the note about draft pull requests, which can also be nice for letting other people know know that other people that you work with what you're working on, so they don't try to do something else with your files that will make the merge unpleasant. Yes. And just to avoid duplicate work sometimes, especially in open source, that can be one way of doing that. And we'll talk about another way of doing that as well. So now I've made a pull request. And so if I am, and I can actually change to, well, first let's go through the slides that bring us up to that. So I've made my big changes, saved that, made the pull request with all the things in it. There's a try it list if you'd like to go through that on your own. Now we're going to get to commenting on those PRs. So if I now switch to, I have my pull request here that I've made, and I can see it's in a list of multiple pull requests that have been made against this repository. And if I switch browsers over to a version where I'm logged in as not so thorough, whoa, too much. now I can see when I go to the pull request, which didn't refresh, there they are, I can go and look at this one and I can make comments on it. On a public repository or any repository that you have read access to, anybody who can see the repository or access the repository, I should say, you don't have to see it, can comment or access all the pull requests that are on it. So I can look at this. I'm the maintainer, so I'm going to look at it and go, oh, okay, here's some changes. And I can make comments about it. Something that can be particularly useful, and I find this actually especially useful for writers, because one of the ways that you can contribute to open source as a writer is to do writing review on other people's pull requests, because you might not know about how this particular technology works, or you might not be familiar with it, but you can provide clarity and other writing expertise to something that's written by someone who doesn't have that expertise. And that can be a really valuable contribution to open source documentation. It can be on an existing pull request, or you can edit something later. But something you can do inside of GitHub is you can make comments on it as a whole, but you can also comment on specific lines. So what I just did is when you go to a line, these files only have one line in them, so they're not very interesting. But you can go to a line and click the plus icon. And when you do that, it'll open a window. And you can also actually select multiple numbers if you want to comment on multiple lines. You can select multiples and then click the plus icon at the end of it and leave a comment on the line and say, I don't know, yeah. This line could use more words. And something that's a relatively new feature inside of GitHub that I find really useful, especially when reviewing other people's writing, because for one thing, if you're writing in Markdown or very much prose inside of GitHub, a paragraph is usually a single line. So you make one line comment and it might actually be like several wrapped lines. And if you want to say, you actually need a comma after the first while in the third sentence, it's a real pain. So they have this thing now where you can insert a suggestion. And if you click this little button, it puts this kind of strange formatted text in here. But what I can do is I can make edits to that existing text. And if I click on the preview, I can see what that's going to look like. It's saying, I'm going to make this suggested change, and I'm suggesting that you add these two words into it. And I can add that as a single comment, which will be added to the list of comments for the pull request right away. Or I can say start a review, which means that it will save my comments and not post them until I'm done with my review. So I did add a review. And so I can see this comment because it's pending, though. Nobody else can see it. While I'm working on it, I'm the only person who can see it. But it has this suggestion in here that when the person who's reading these comments, they'll actually be able to commit that if they want to. And I'm going to make one other comment in here. Not a whole lot to say there. And I can add multiple comments all into a single review. And then you can see that it gathers them up and bundles them into one. So now I can say, this is great. I left one suggestion. And you can just leave it as a comment that's kind of neutral. You can request changes, which depending on repository settings, might actually prevent it from being merged until those changes are approved. Or you can approve and say, hey, that's ready to go. Everything looks good. So if I click request changes, then if we go back, this is now back to the pull request view. I'm gonna make that one smaller. You can see my comment. This was the main like meta comment for my review, and then my inline comments that went with it afterwards. And it also now has next to me a little icon that says, hey, I requested changes. So if you make those changes, you can re-request my review. So if I flip back, to my very thorough user, I'm the one who made the PR, I can go and look and say, oh, they've made some requests to make changes. The cool thing about these suggested changes is I can commit them directly. And you can even, if there are multiple ones, bundle them up together and then commit them all at once. So I can say, I can change the message if I want to. And commit that, and that'll commit it directly to the PR. Which is very handy. So the thing is that sometimes they don't actually make suggestions like that you can just click and commit. They might just say, could you clarify this thing? Or you need to optimize your image before you upload it, or things like that. And I know when I was first contributing to open source and I, put up a PR and then someone said, oh, this is great, but can you change XYZ? And I thought, well, how do I do that? Do I make a new PR? Because like this one's all done, and do I like take that one down and put up a new one? Actually, all you have to do is go to your version of it. Well, there's two ways you can do it. You can actually, from within the PR itself, you can actually edit files. You click that little dot menu, you can get straight into editing. And that will, as you can see, take it to my fork and put me into the editor view inside of my fork. So what it did was it was basically just a shortcut that took me to my fork and the branch that I made on my fork. And any commits, you can do that from your fork, you can do it from that link. Any commits that you make to the branch that was used in your PR will automatically get added to that PR. So if I commit this, and now when we go back to the PR comments, you can see that there's a new commit added in there. And if we look at the files changed, my change is now in the PR. So you don't have to do anything special to make the PR. You just need to make changes to the branch that the PR was on, and any changes you make on that branch will automatically go on. Which also means that if you're in a situation where you're making multiple PRs to a repository, which has happened to me when I'm guiding people through Hack Night open source events, you have to make a new branch for each new change. Otherwise, it's going to smush them all together into the same PR. So we got through those things. Making the line comments, creating the review. So you can try that. Now, something to say about when there are requests for changes. I just kind of want to put it out there that it's totally normal. I think it can be kind of intimidating when you're basically doing this in public and you're learning it in public. This is your first PR to a public repository. It can be intimidating, but it's totally normal for people to ask for changes or to say that like, hey, this is actually the format that we expect you to do it. And hey, guess what? That's probably something they should add to their contribution guide. And guess what your next contribution can be is to improve their docs for contributors. And so I think it's normal to be told that. And it's also something to remember that like, yes, you didn't know, but all of these conventions are different from repo to repo and org to org. So it's totally normal for you not to know those things. And it's also kind of on them that they didn't communicate that. And you can help them communicate that to the next person. And for the most part, maintainers are friendly and helpful and appreciate the things that you're doing. But they aren't all. And if you encounter one who isn't, then maybe they're not worth your time. And so, consider contributing somewhere else where they are nicer. They don't necessarily need your free labor, and you don't have to give it to them. So that's my soapbox on that one. Now, pushing changes to an existing PR, we already mentioned. And uploading files works the same way, where you edit inside of your PR. So all those things that I was doing, if you're inside of your branch on your fork, look at me go. And you make sure that you're inside of that big changes branch, I can do all the changes that I did before, editing files, uploading files, all of those things. And so. Now, merging the PR, I have to switch back over to my not so thorough user. So I've submitted my review. They made changes. They committed my suggestion. Actually, I need to refresh the page. So all that looks great. I'm happy with it now. So I can go back into files changed and I can say, great changes. And you can also, because yeah, it's like a requirement everywhere now, you can add emojis to it too. And approve it. Approving it doesn't actually do anything except put some checkboxes and things, and in some repositories makes it possible to merge. Some repositories have their settings set so that you can't merge a PR unless it has approval from a certain person or group of people or from anybody. But now it's mergeable. So here I am as the maintainer. I can click to merge that pull request. There are actually some options for that. I'm not going to go into explaining those ones right now. But when I do that, it's going to create a new commit message that merges that one. And well, when we merge it this way. And then when I do that, all I have to do is click confirm merge. And now it changes to merged. And if I go into the pull request list, it's no longer listed in the open pull requests. It's closed because it's been merged. And sometimes they're closed without being merged. There might be a variety of reasons for closing a pull request that hasn't been merged. And if I go to the code, the changes are in there now too. The special fork file, the subfolder, and the images and the text. All of those things are now inside of the main not so thorough version to match up with the fork that was there before. So that one, I find it's actually kind of a magical thing when you maintain an open source project or something that is open source, and just, you might even file an issue that you put up there, and we'll talk about issues in a minute, and say like, oh, I need to do this thing. It's on my to-do list, or that's something I've always been meaning to do or something. And then all of a sudden somebody shows up and says, hey, I fixed this thing for you. Or hey, I added this documentation. And then, you review it. Sometimes those reviews can be long. But then you click a button and it's added in, and it's from a person that you didn't even know existed. And I kind of love that. So let's switch back over. So we've merged the PR, and now we're going to talk about what I just mentioned, which was issues. And yes, squashing with the merge is usually what I typically do. I didn't want to get into the details of that, but when you squash and merge, you basically take all those little commits and you put them into one. You squash
everything I've been bringing up is from hard and generally painful experience.
Yeah. I mean, there are reasons sometimes when you don't want to squash, or someone might squash within it. And one thing I will say too, is that's something that's going to vary by project. Some projects, they want you to squash. Some projects, they don't. If you're just making a contribution to something where you're not a maintainer, it doesn't matter because you're not going to be one doing the merging. But if you have one, you should look into what those options are. GitHub has good help on that stuff. If you look at what those options are and you look at what the different merging is, you can learn about it. I agree with Chris that I prefer the squash and merge as well, because it just makes things neater. You don't have as many commits in your history. But talking about issues. So issues are another thing that GitHub adds onto Git, which is, it doesn't change code in any way. They're there for conversation, for tracking requests for changes, unlike pull requests, which are actually more a proposal of something you've already made. Issues are more saying, this needs to be done. This is a bug that I found. What do you think about if we restructured things like this? There are all sorts of uses for issues. They're there for discussion and for tracking of work. So sometimes they're just for conversations about how to do something. Sometimes they might be more like a ticket for work. Like if you use Jira, it would be like a Jira ticket or something like that, although much less detailed. And so issues are kind of the conversation space, and it's a good place for you to find out more about a repository. You don't normally always just go up to a repository and say like, hey, I think they should change this, and then you just make a proposal out of there. Issues can be a good way to first see what do they actually need in this repository. You're much more likely to meet the needs of the repo maintainers if you make a contribution that actually addresses an issue that's already been filed, to say, hey, here's a bug, or here's something that we'd like someone to help out with. And issues can have labels on them, and we'll get into that a little bit more. This is an example of the, this one is the www repo for the San Francisco Write the Docs meetup, and it has some labels on it for Hacktoberfest, which is an event that I'll mention a little bit later in here. Labels could have all sorts of things in there that help you find issues that might be more relevant to you, or ones that you might be more interested in working on. Another thing, so as an alternative to creating a draft PR, and this was something that also, before you could make draft PRs, was one of the only ways you could do this, is to sort of claim something that you're working on, especially if you're at like a hack night or working in something where there's a lot of different people making contributions to a repo at the same time. You might look at an issue and say, oh, this one needs to have the links updated in the README. And someone else looks at that same thing, and both of you go and do the same thing. So it's helpful to make a comment in the issue and say, hey, I'm going to be working on this, just so nobody else starts working on the same thing. It's also valid and helpful and useful to ask questions at this stage too, and say like, hey, I noticed that this is, would this link work okay? Or things like that. You can ask them before you get started on that. And it's a great time to get clarification before you dig into the work. So, and actually, well, yeah, you saw a sample of those issues, but they are under the issues tab, and they'll vary from repo to repo. Oops. So now switching to some closing thoughts and next steps from this after you've had this opportunity to find out about these different parts. One thing is looking for other projects where you can contribute to. There are probably at this point millions of repositories on GitHub, and finding out where would be a good place to start can be overwhelming, especially if you're new to this. This list has a few friendly repos that can be good for making contributions that are text-based contributions. Awesome lists is something that is kind of a tradition, I guess you could say, or kind of a meme on GitHub, where people make lists of things. So, and this particular repo is a awesome list of awesome lists. So it has lists of all different things that could be lists. So it could be lists of things about programming languages, or lists of places you can go on vacation, or lists of anything. An awesome list can be a list of cool things of any sort. And so you could make your own repository that has an awesome list of stuff, and then you can contribute that list to this list of awesome lists. Or you could go to any one of these lists that's in the list of awesome lists and make contributions to an existing list. The nice thing about those is that they're pretty small contributions. It's something that you can do to sort of get practice using the interface and doing those sorts of things. First Timer's Guide is one that, instead of being a list of lists, is a list of guides. And it's for first timers in two different ways. It's geared towards people who are making their first time commits, and it's a place where you can make guides for people who are for the first time learning about the thing that you make a guide about. And it could be a guide about anything. So there are ones that are on software topics, but there are also some guides that go into like other strange topics. Oh, they're all mostly software. But you could make a guide about anything that you know about and add it to this list of guides. And so that's another example of something that's text-based contributions. San Francisco Write the Docs has repositories for Lone Writer's Guide, which is basically a book in a repo guiding people who are the only writer at their company. Some of the organizers of Write the Docs are involved in maintaining that repository. So if you have questions, there are lots of friendly people here who can help you with it. And then also the website for the meetup group is also an open source repository that you can make contributions to. And I can vouch for the friendliness of all the people running those repos. So, and someone also linked in here the Good Docs project, which is another one that you can also look into contributing to as well. And we have a past meetup at this point, probably about 4 or 5 months ago, that we should have in our history, a presentation by Aaron McKean about the Good Docs project, and telling about how that works and how you can make contributions to it. There are also programs and events that encourage people who are new to writing open source, or specifically documentarians. So it just so happens that next month is October, and every October, DigitalOcean runs an event called Hacktoberfest, which encourages local, and now probably not very many local, remote events for driving contributions to open source, resources for finding places where you can contribute, guides to how to contribute. And actually, I was just looking in the open source channel of Write the Docs Slack, where there are also many people are actually organizing hack projects for Hacktoberfest on that. So we'll talk about that in a second. There's also another opportunity is the Google Season of Docs. They have a Summer of Code thing that's for students coding in open source. Then they started this Season of Docs, which is a 3-month fellowship that includes a stipend that pairs up technical writers with open source projects. So that's another, you have to apply and things like that, but that's another opportunity for getting involved in open source, specifically for documentation. And then also you can find projects by searching for them and searching for issues. There are a couple websites, issuehub.io and upforgrabs.net, that are ways that you can search issues across all of GitHub. And actually, IssueHub was the one I wanted to look at. This one, I actually had forgotten how it works. I feel like when you click on these things, usually it should just give you the list, but you actually have to click find. So I wanted to put that note in there so you don't think it's broken. These are labels that can be useful. There happens to be a documentation label, and you could also say documentation good first issue. And so you're looking for issues that people consider good for people who are new, and it's documentation focused. And if you click find, it'll filter out issues, 1,934 issues that have both of those tags on them, and you can look through those ones as possibilities. Another thing that could be useful, and this link actually goes to a search inside of GitHub, which is looking at open pull requests with the label documentation added to them. So these are ones that pull requests that someone has already made that you might consider reviewing to add writerly expertise to the documentation that someone has submitted in this pull request. And so that's another possibility to look at. And there are lots of them, 3,700. When you do that, you might look at those and go, well, why should I contribute to this one? Like, how do I assess that? One good thing to look at a repository is to look at its community profile. This link is basically, whoops, that's not the one I wanted to click. GitHub's docs on what the community profile is. As an example, you can go to something like this one, and you'll find the profile under the Insights tab. And the Insights tab can say some things about how active the repository is and things like that. There aren't any active pull requests on it right now, or issues, so this one might not be super active. And then if you click the Community tab, what this does is it's actually looking for some of those special files that I was talking about in the beginning and seeing that repositories have those. They're a good signal for a repository that has thought through the process of what it means to contribute to the repository and ways that people interact with each other. So it's a good idea to look for one that has a code of conduct, that has a contributor guide. Now, there's nothing about this that guarantees that the contributing guide is actually useful, but they have one, which is a good step. And then you can click on these links to get to those files directly and find out more about them. So that's one of the ways that GitHub has tried to sort of give people more signals of assessing the health of a project. And another thing within the project itself is to look at existing issues and pull requests. So this has 27 open pull requests, and many of them are pretty old. In fact, probably a lot of them, since they're in October 2019, were probably for last year's Hacktoberfest. So maybe that one might not be such a good one to contribute to, because your pull request might sit there and not ever get any attention. It can be good to look for ones that they might have a lot of open pull requests, but they're mostly pretty recent, so maybe they're keeping up on it more. Another thing you can do is look at existing issues and pull requests and see how people talk to each other about stuff. You know, are they friendly? Are they supportive? Are they mentoring to new people? Or are they rude? And if they're rude, you can move on. And another thing you can do is watch repositories for things that you use and kind of get a sense of how it works and what they're doing. And over time, as you get to know it better, then you can see where it might be a good place for you to contribute. Beyond this, the web UI will get you pretty far in a lot of this stuff, but there are things that you can't do in the GitHub web UI. It's difficult to sync your fork with that upstream repo. Like now that we've made changes to that upstream, that my fork of that animated telegraph repo actually now doesn't match up. And if I make new pull requests, it's going to be wonky. You can actually do a reverse pull request to request the master back to yours, but it's confusing, and in a lot of ways it's better to just handle it in new ways. So if you're doing a lot of this, you might want to move away from the UI version. It doesn't handle more complex merge conflicts. I cut merge conflicts out of this shortened version of the thing, but if you've made a contribution to a file and that file has changed since you made your PR, there might be ways that now Git doesn't actually know which version it should take. And so you have to resolve that merge conflict by saying, okay, you need to take this part from this one and this part from this one. That's the way it's supposed to be. Okay, cool. And then Git knows. But that can be handled on a single file level inside of the GitHub UI, and it'll actually tell you you have a conflict. It'll kind of guide you through how to do it. But for more complex ones, you simply can't do it inside the UI. So that would be another case where it goes out. And then sometimes it can be difficult to preview changes to things. Sometimes you need to be able to run that locally or something like that. So at those points, that might be a point where you want to start learning to use Git from the command line. And here are some other resources for learning about that. GitHub has some pretty nice guides of their own about open source and Git and GitHub. Can't See Dots has a video series about it. I liked the story about one person's journey into open source. And then also another great resource is inside of the Write the Doc Slack. We have an open source channel, and you can talk to other people who are doing things in open source, see events. You can find out there that people are planning events for Hacktoberfest that you can get involved in. I always find the people in Write the Docs helpful in their Slack, so it's a good place to go. And that's the end of my slides. If you have more questions, you can, well, we have a little time to do it now, but you can also find me in the Write the Doc Slack. My username is Very Thorough. I have to say it that way. Otherwise, like I say, I'm very thorough in Slack, and everybody says, okay. But yes, you can find me by that username. You can also go to that open source channel if you have other questions too. So, and I've sort of been following the chat, but it's also been pretty chatty. So, anyone have any questions? You gotta wait long enough for it to be awkward, so that. All right, well, cool. Or if there are questions too, if you have comments or any other things like that too. I know some people have been sharing ideas within the chat. If you have other ideas or things like that you'd like to share, other projects that you found useful to jump into, that's also helpful. I see, Chris, you raised your hand. I'll call on you. I get to go to my elementary school teaching days.
What got you into GitHub and writing documentation? Because I did take a peek at your website and your username, but it's
very old.
Oh, okay. Well, but I was just curious.
Yeah. So, well, I went through a lot of different, I was a teacher, and then I was a nanny, and then the mother of the kid that I nanny needed a website, so I learned web development back in like 2006. Started building websites like from like Notepad, and and was a web developer for about 10 years, and actually started getting involved in open source by contributing to the Girl Develop It curriculum online, making slide presentations like this and working on workshops. And then now most of those contributions that you see on my GitHub are actually in private repositories, but some of them are in public ones. And got into documentation because I like explaining things, and did that in writing too, and started doing that for Netlify and did that for a few years. But now I decided that I really like explaining things and making them by explaining them. So now I'm working in product. So that's kind of the journey in the short form.
Thank you, Jessica, for that wonderful presentation. That was super useful. I learned a lot of fun new tricks, and I think everyone else did as well. Thank you also to Alyssa for joining us tonight and hosting the Zoom call, and to everyone who attended for joining us to learn about GitHub together.